Before we begin with this episode, I believe it serves to deliver a warning. This episode will predominantly be dealing with the concentration camp known as Dora. For this, there will be details that some listeners may find disturbing. Whilst I do not wish to make listeners uncomfortable, I believe with the subject matter at hand, we should. To make the history PG friendly would be to diminish the horrors of the concentration camp system and the systematic terrors that the Nazi regime not only brought upon the Jewish people of Europe, but on many people the Nazis classified as enemies. If we water the horrors down, we become complacent to the lessons of history, and this in itself is a crime. Therefore, I deliver this warning that there may be some parts of this episode some may find disturbing. The Allies were closing in. News was coming from Berlin that the Soviets were beginning to surround the capital. But here, in the mountainous heart of Germany, it was the Americans, the British, and their allies that were rapidly advancing. The leadership, the SS Guards, were growing twitchy. There was much movement within their ranks. For these people, the guarding of the emaciated, broken, crippled, and diseased ghosts of a once proud people was a luxury. A placement that brought little fear of death, at least for themselves. In reality, their job was to be death. To wipe away life not with the gentle passage of time and deliverance of Thanatos to the river Styx, but of the Kyries, the blood-suckling spirit of violence and untimely death. They drank and sung in good spirits, as through the night and day those incarcerated wearing the colours of their crimes toiled to build the vengeance weapons for a war that could not be won, as those on high delayed until the country was burned and Germany destroyed. Now their haven away from the near-certain death of the Eastern Front had the potential to deliver death unto themselves, not through bullet or mortar, but through the horrors of what they had done in stealing dignity and life from those within. They needed to hide. One idea that sprung to mind was to escort all of the prisoners from the camp into the tunnels in which they had worked for the last 18 months. Destroy the entranceways and throw gas canisters within. But it was quickly realized too much gas would be required and the tunnels were not weathertight, and the plan would fail technically. So it was on the night of the 3rd of April 1945 that the night shift was told to lay down its tools. For the first time since production of the vengeance weapons within these tunnels did the sounds of machinery no longer echo deep within. For the first time, there was no shift change. Those who fell that day were not to be withdrawn. Those still hanging from the rafters were to be left. Gathered outside as morning broke on the 4th, all prisoners, day and night shift, were gathered. Spring was making an appearance, and snow only rested on the top of the tallest mountains as the mercury within the thermometers read 8 degrees. From one of the buildings, someone exited with a stack of clothes within their hands and began to hand them out to some of the prisoners. At the gate, the SS guards were stacking wooden crates. Forward, the order was cried by SS Untersturmführer Erhard Browny. The prisoners were to march from the gates. Their clothes were a shabby collection of the blue and white overalls all prisoners within the concentration camp system were obliged to wear. But some still held onto the blazers and jackets with which they had arrived, from which threads had started to tear. As the shabby collection of men marched through the gates, from the crates laid out, the capos handed the prisoners each an 850-gram tin of meat and a singular loaf of bread. In columns they marched, fragmented into groups under the command of a group of officers whose badges worn upon their head spoke that their purpose was only to be the bringers of death. Through valleys whose rivers had swollen with the melt of winter snow, through small towns whose buildings had been largely destroyed by the aerial war, and through villages that showed almost no sign that war had been playing out for 6 years. Under the stares of the residents who saw with blind eyes the horrors their regime had inflicted upon their fellow man, they continued for day and into night as they marched north. If one fell, he was shot. There was to be no stragglers and no left behinds, with still a breath possible within their bodies. Finally, the 40 or so kilometers had been marched. With little remaining energy the prisoners had being depleted, they were forced into cattle carts that sat waiting at stations. For some, this was in Osterode, for others, Wernigerode. The trains, loaded with human life, moved slowly forward. Under steam, they advanced with little speed, slowly creeping away from the western front of war. Inside, no straw covered the floor, there was no bucket for use as a toilet, and many were suffering from diarrhea. Soon the floor was covered in excrement. Upon leaving the camp, the prisoners had little idea that the food handed to them was to last them for many days, and soon starvation set in, especially amongst those who, upon having what was to them a large ration of food handed to them, had wolfed it down, and looked upon with envy at those who had rationed the measly supply. Occasionally loaves of bread would be thrown through the barbed wire that covered the small rectangular openings towards the roof of the cart, but what was thrown in soon was fought over. For days the train would start and stop. Within the cart, life was hellish, but outside, away from the view of the human life and devastation, the local NSDAP leadership was debating what to do. Gerhard Tyler knew that the 4,000 former prisoners that had left the camp were soon to be entering his district, and was determined a solution should be found before the arrival of the Allies. Many had fallen to the ground, slumped within the carts where there was no room to lie down, but these would not rise again, and nor would the trains move forward. The intense aerial bombing had destroyed much of the rail infrastructure, and the trains could go no further. The doors were flung open by the SS guards, and the prisoners ordered out. Some were loaded onto carts. Those that could no longer walk, the carts were then dragged by other prisoners. Hungry and exhausted, a group of Russian prisoners saw, at the side of a field, a pile of turnips. Their eyes wide, they dove onto the fresh food which might give them strength, but the SS guards opened fire. The column continued to march. More and more prisoners that fell out of line were being gunned down by the SS troops. Over 100 in one village, Eichstätt alone. Those who were able to sum up the energy and had the courage to do so were also able to escape into the woods, whilst the SS guards were preoccupied. By the 13th of April, over 1,000 prisoners had been gathered near the town of Gardelegen in an old cavalry stables. But if they thought that the rest from the march had arrived, they were wrong. Once again, they were forced to move on. They were marched through the fields and farmland of the local estates. At 7, as the sun began to descend behind the horizon, they arrived at another barn. It was a field barn, whose sides had been bricked up, built high for the storage of straw or hay and capped with a solid roof. But judging by the smell, it had been used by the Wehrmacht to store fuel rather than straw, although straw did still litter the floor. Inside, the over 1,000 prisoners were pushed. Suddenly, under the orders of Untersturmführer Browning, 3 of the 4 rolling doors were slammed closed. The 4th remained open, but under the watch of SS men, Luftwaffe soldiers, parachutists, Volkssturm, and others. Browning stepped forward, and kneeling down, he fiddled at the entranceway. Quickly, those at the front of the group of prisoners realized that it was a small flame within his hand, and he was setting fire to the straw that had been soaked with gasoline by the capos, the straw that was now ablaze. Inside, chaos broke out. Screams of curses and fear filled the air as smoke filled the space and the flames spread rapidly. Some, realizing that the situation could be controlled, shouted orders to use their clothes to stamp out the flames. The SS just watched on through the opening. They watched the desperation of the prisoners, and with an order from Browning, they lowered their guns and began to fire. When a break in the firing to reload took place, some guards pulled their grenades from their belts and threw them into the barn. Those who fell injured were burnt up by the flames. Voices begged to be shot to end the misery. As bullets continued to be unleashed into the barn after the sun had set, Some prisoners, cowering in the dark recesses of the barn, dug at the floor with spoons and shifted the earth enough to allow for an emaciated body to squeeze through and escape into the night. 20 or so managed to do so. The next day, the barn still echoed with the moans of the dying. Some had managed to survive the night by hiding under the bodies of those already dead. Then arrived Gerhard Tyler. Upon surveying the site, he ordered for traces of the massacre to be removed, for more gasoline to be poured within the building, and for a never inferno to be unleashed. A pit was dug for the bodies of those already dead, only 90 centimeters deep, but 55 meters long. But as dead bodies were brought out, prisoners were found still alive. Through the morning they worked to remove the traces, but how could they? It is not easy to erase the site of a massacre of 1,016 people. By early afternoon, word arrived the Americans were near. The SS workers laid down their tools and fled, leaving the smouldering barn as a beacon for the troops of the 102nd Infantry Division to take the town of Gardelegen and discover the site of the massacre. The massacre of 1,016 in horrendous circumstances of the people who had been forced to make Wernher von Braun's rockets.
Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren.
Welcome to the Achtung History Podcast, produced by the Berlin Tour Guide and presented by myself, Simon J. James. This week, episode 3 of The Nazi and the Moon, Dora. Allied air raids over German industrial centres were not uncommon. Since the defeat of the Luftwaffe in the so-called Battle of Britain, the British had been able to increase their indiscriminate bombing over Germany. However, the British predominantly focused upon the bombing of civilians, and it was with the Americans' entry into the war that the bombing raids over Germany truly began to focus on the destruction of the means of war rather than the people. As Minister of Armaments, Speer was well aware and informed of how much effect the bombings over Germany were having on production, especially on one of the more crucial aspects of all, the production of ball bearings. He later would remember,
"We barely escaped a further catastrophic blow on August the 17th, 1943, only 2 weeks after the Hamburg bombings. The American Air Force launched its first strategic raid. It was directed against Schweinfurt, where large factories of the ball bearing industry were concentrated. Ball bearings had in any case already become a bottleneck in our efforts to increase armaments production. But in this very first attack, the other side committed a crucial mistake. Instead of concentrating on the ball bearing plants, the sizable force of 376 flying fortresses divided up. 146 of the planes successfully attacked an airplane assembly plant in Regensburg, but with only minor consequences. Meanwhile, the British Air Force continued its indiscriminate attacks upon our cities. After this attack, the production of ball bearings dropped by 38%. Despite the peril of Schweinfurt, we had to patch up our facilities there, for to attempt to relocate our ball bearing industry would have had held up production entirely for 3 or 4 months. In the light of our desperate needs, we could also do nothing about the ball bearing factories in Berlin-Erkner, Cannstatt, or Stier, although the enemy must have been aware of their location. In June 1946, the General Staff of the Royal Air Force asked me what would have been the result of concentrated attacks on the ball bearing industry. I replied, armaments productions would have been crucially weakened after 2 months, and after 4 months would have been brought completely to a standstill. This, to be sure, would have meant, 1, all our ball bearing factories had been attacked simultaneously. 2, these attacks had been repeated 3 or 4 times every 2 weeks, not matter what the pictures of the target area showed. 3, any attempt at rebuilding these factories had been thwarted by further attacks, spaced at 2-month intervals. After this first blow, we were forced back on the ball bearing stocks stored by the armed forces for use as repair parts. We soon consumed these, as well as whatever had been accumulated in the factories for current production. After these reserves were used up, they lasted for 6 to 8 weeks. The sparse production was carried daily from the factories to the assembly plants, often in knapsacks. In those days, we actually asked ourselves how soon the enemy would realize that he could paralyze the production of thousands of armaments plants merely by destroying 5 or 6 relatively small targets. The second serious blow, however, did not come until 2 months later. On October 14, 1943, I was at the East Prussian headquarters discussing armaments questions with Hitler when Adjutant Schaub interrupted us. "The Third Reich Marshal urgently wishes to speak to you," he said to Hitler. This time he has pleasant news. Hitler came back from the telephone in good spirits. A new daylight raid on Schweinfurt had ended with a great victory for our defenses, he said. The countryside was strewn with downed American bombers. Uneasy, I asked for a short recess in our conference, since I wanted to telephone Schweinfurt myself. But all communications were shattered. I could not reach any of the factories. Finally, by enlisting the police, I managed to talk to the foreman of a ball bearing factory. All the factories had been hard hit, he informed me. The oils baths for the bearings had caused serious fires in the machinery workshops. The damage was far worse than after the first attack. This time, we had lost 67% of our ball bearing production. My first measure after this second air raid was to appoint my most vigorous associate, General Manager Kessler, as Special Commissioner for Ball Bearing Production. Our reserves had been consumed. Efforts to import ball bearings from Sweden and Switzerland had met with only slight success. Nevertheless, we were able to avoid total disaster by substituting slide bearings for ball bearings wherever possible. But what really saved us was the fact that from this time on, the enemy, to our astonishment, once again ceased his attacks on the ball bearing industry.
For Peenemünde, although von Braun and his associates' efforts to dive into the flames and salvage what they could had led to much of the essential paperwork being saved, much was lost in the air raid of the night of the 17th of August 1943, the same night that Speer refers to as the night the RAF bombed Hamburg. As a highly specialized establishment, it was not like the ball bearing production that was in Schweinfurt, Berlin-Erkner, and Cannstatt. The one raid that was led by the British, whose planes had dropped their markers 3 kilometers south of the base, had proved successful, even if only a few bombs had hit the area of the base. The British had heard of Peenemünde and the strange events that were happening on the island of Usedom in the Baltic. Fishermen had reported strange sightings of objects darting into the skies, and these fishermen, the non-German ones, had slowly circulated the stories. In June of 1943, 2 months before the air raid, this information, anonymously received by the British naval attaché in Norway and named after said city, made its way to the British government. But rumours from the Polish underground, who had some members working on Usedom, had also spread to the British, and it was also in June that a mosquito had flown over the Peenemünde site, taking aerial reconnaissance photographs, which, when developed, showed the worrying information that Germany was working on something futuristic and potentially dangerous, hence the decision to launch the aerial attack on the facility. The area that had been most damaged was the area which caused many of the problems and had been the principal doubt of Hitler in the program, the guidance systems. The raid had delayed the production of guidance systems and electrical equipment. When launching resumed, with tests from a base in Poland, farther away from the Western Allies' air superiority, and at Peenemünde, 39 A4s had been launched. 11 of these had failed due to problems with the propulsion systems. 14 failed due to the guidance problems, and of the 8 launched in Poland, just 1 had worked. Where the Allies had failed to repeatedly stop the German production of war equipment due to the lack of concentrated bombing, the erratic nature of their targets had led to setting back the rocket program significantly. It was at this time that the camp of Mittelbau Dora, Mittelbau was the factory name and Dora the camp name, was increasing the numbers enslaved within its bare rock tunnels to produce von Braun's rockets. From a few hundred prisoners in September, By the end of the year, as rocket after rocket proved unsuccessful, over 12,000 people were living in squalor so that von Braun could pursue his dreams, and all were living under the careful eye and brutal fist of the SS. With the visits earlier in the year that Heinrich Himmler to Peenemünde had made, the interest the Reichsführer SS had in developing the A4 rocket program had grown. It was a decision that was made in part on the 20th of August, when Hitler ordered Minister of Armament Speer to the headquarters of Himmler.
The result was that we had to work out guidelines for a joint undertaking with the SS leadership, what was to be called the Central Works, Mittelwerk. My assistants went into it reluctantly, and their fears were soon confirmed. Formally speaking, we remained in charge of the manufacturing, but in case of doubt, we had to yield to the superior power of the SS leadership. Thus, Himmler had put a foot in our door, and we ourselves had helped him do it. Himmler had conferred an honorary rank in the SS upon almost every government minister whose personal or political weight he had to reckon with. He had reserved a particularly high distinction for me. He wanted to make me an SS Obergruppenführer, a rank corresponding to that of a full general in the army, and one very rarely conferred. But although he let me know how unusual the honor was, I refused his offer with polite phrases. By confirming such ranks, Himmler, of course, meant to gain influence and thrust his way into areas not yet under his command. My suspicions proved only too justified. Himmler promptly made every effort to push his way into the field of armaments production. He readily offered countless prisoners, and as early as 1942 began placing pressure on a number of my assistants. As far as we could make out, he wanted to turn the concentration camps into large modern factories, especially for armaments, with the SS continuing to have direct control of them.
At the meeting on the 20th of August 1943, Himmler broke the news to Speer that he was now the Minister of the Interior, and as a member of the government, which he had not been until this point, he was now Speer's equal within that sphere, and this gave him greater control over the A4 rocket program. He told Speer,
"I require a first-class staff of your engineers, who will have to be responsible to both of us for the strict execution of the Führer's orders. On my side, I have assigned Kammler, one of my most capable SS commanders."
Kammler was Hans Kammler, born on the 26th of August 1901 in Stettin. He was a member of the NSDAP before Hitler came to power, joining as the tide of support for the future dictator swelled with the economic crisis and political crisis of the Weimar Republic at the end of the 1920s and that flowed over into the 1930s. As a civil engineer, he was employed in the Department of Building within the Aviation Ministry in 1933. The same year, he became a member of the SS. Within the SS, Kammler was very quickly put to work, rising through the ranks. Like Dr. Hans Globke was in his relentless legal persecution of the Jews, pragmatic and level-headed, seeing not the destruction of humanity, but rather the completion of a goal, i.e., the destruction of the Jewish people. Dr. Kammler was also just as practical. Rudolf Höss, camp commandant of Auschwitz, the largest slaughterhouse in human history, as described in his own words, wrote in his memoirs,
"My meeting with Himmler was in the summer of 1942, when he visited Auschwitz for the second and final time. The inspection lasted for 2 days, and Himmler examined everything in great detail. There were present, among others, Gauleiter Bracht, Obergruppenführer Schmauser, and Dr. Kammler. After his arrival in the camp, we went to the SS officers' mess, where I had to explain the layout of the camp with the aid of maps. Then we went to the architect's office, where Kammler produced designs and models with which to explain the constructional work which had been proposed or was already in place."
Kammler was very much trusted by Himmler to be his solver of problems. Himmler, like Hitler, did not understand production. They saw numbers as success and always failed to take into account problems of material supply, production techniques, workers' health, etc. With workers, if a factory had 3,000 workers, to the mind of Himmler and Hitler, it had 3,000 able-bodied workers, not emancipated, starving, crippled workers due to the situation in which the German government and SS had put them. This was similar with Hitler in the Eastern Front, especially Stalingrad, and not taking into account the exhaustion the soldiers of the Wehrmacht were suffering from, least of all the lack of supplies from food or ammunition. When on Himmler's 1942 visit to Auschwitz, Huss took Himmler amongst the camp's facilities, including a synthetic rubber camp. But after this, Himmler was taken to the sewer gas facility.
It was one of the worst spots in Auschwitz, and it affected everyone. The drainage water from the base camp was discharged, without any purification worth mentioning, directly into the Zola. The population was constantly exposed to the danger of infection, because of the disease which were always rampant in the camp. The Gauleiter described the position with great clarity, and asked in unmistakable terms for assistance. Kammler will apply all his energies to the problem, was Himmler's reply.
At the end of the visit, Himmler turned to Huss and said,
"You must see to it that swift progress is made with the building of Birkenau. The gypsies are to be destroyed. The Jews who are unfit for work are to be destroyed with the same ruthlessness. Soon the labor camps at the armaments factories will absorb the first large contingent of able-bodied Jews, and that will give you some breathing space. Armaments factories will be built in Auschwitz. Kammler will give you far-reaching support in matters connected with their construction."
Kammler was to Himmler, now as Minister of the Interior as well as Reichsführer SS, his right-hand man. The man who would get things done that needed doing and urgently, hence his placement at Mittelbau Dora. Mittelbau Dora was, when founded in the late summer of 1943, a subcamp of Buchenwald, a camp which in itself was one of the earliest and the largest within Germany's pre-war borders, as a reaction to the meeting held by Himmler to which Speer was present. The new camp was 84 kilometers northwest of Buchenwald, itself situated near the historic town of Weimar, that was once home to Bach, Berlioz, Cranach, Dietrich, Goethe, Schiller, and Zeiss, let alone the town that gave its name to the republic that Hitler had so hated. Set amongst the rolling hills of the Harz Mountains, Mittelbau Dora would dive deep into the stone to find protection from the air in the mountain of the Kronstein. A company was set up, the Mittelwerk GmbH, a limited liability company. This was something that Herr Degenkolb had tried to do at Peenemünde previously, to try and wrestle the control of the rocket facility from the hands of the army and put it into the corrupt hands of individual, opportunistic Nazis. Dornberger had been invited to Berlin in February of 1943 for reasons unknown to him, but soon after his arrival he found out why. He was placed in a room with Professor Hetlager from a department in charge of organizational problems of the German armaments industry, a Herr Machels from the armaments industry in Stettin, and finally Herr Kunze, a representative of Degenkolb. Professor Hetlager had once been with the city treasury of Berlin and was now very powerful within the armaments industry. "Herr Colonel," began Hetlager, "I have invited you here to discuss the best way of transforming the army establishment at Peenemünde into a private stock company." Dornberger was shocked. Degenkolb was trying to steal the program from the army, and Degenkolb, remember, was instrumental in the suicide of Dornberger's mentor, Becker. Dornberger was quick to try and establish from whom the plan had come. May I ask from whom the suggestion came? The plan owes its origin to a proposal of Herr Degenkolb's. Dornberger had suspected that something upon these lines would happen, and he firmly and flatly refused the offer. But in September that same year, Degenkolb won. Speer, Himmler, and Speer's rival, naturally as having one person in charge of armaments would be too complicated, Karl Sauer, agreed to the foundation of Mittelwerk GmbH. On the board was Kammler, whom had proven so very successful at Auschwitz, and was now head of the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungsamt, Amt C, or the SS Economic Administration Office, C, that of construction. Karl Maria Hetlager, member of the SS who had been chosen by Speer to be involved in the Germania project, that had been placed on hold due to the war and was now in the armaments ministry and had held the meeting with Dornberger in February. Later he would be state secretary in the Ministry of Finance of the Adenauer regime. And naturally Gerhard Degenkolb, based on his role, with the Commerzbank. Naturally, these were the board of directors, and the board of directors do not get dirty on the shop floor. Therefore, the role of running the factory that was to be hidden within the Kohlstein was to be given to Albin Swatsky. Swatsky was a March Violet. He was one of those who joined Hitler's NSDAP after they had come to power, using membership to gain an advantageous position within the state. Swatsky had been able to rise to the position of operations manager at Henschel & Son, a company with a rich tradition in the production of iron goods, including steam engines, who would later come to manufacture under Swatsky the Tiger IV tank. Speer had already placed Swatsky at Peenemünde in July 1943, before the air raid, but afterwards Swatsky was put in charge of the labour and operations of the new Mittelwerk operation, and his deputy from Peenemünde was to be Arthur Rudolph. On the 6th of September 1943, Dornberger would meet the man now in charge of building Mittelbau, and who had taken prestige in the contract that was awarded the new Mittelwerk GmbH company for 12,000 rockets, Kammler.
I first met Dr. Kammler whilst on a duty trip to Berlin. He had a slim figure of a cavalryman, neither tall nor short. In his early 40s, broad-shouldered and narrow in the hips, with bronzed, clear-cut features, a high forehead under dark hair slightly streaked with grey and brushed straight back. Dr. Kammler had piercing and restless brown eyes, a lean, curved beak of a nose, and a strong mouth, the underlip thrust forward as though in defiance. That mouth indicated brutality, derision, disdain, and overweening pride. The chin was well moulded and prominent. One's first impression was of a virile, handsome, and captivating personality. He looked like some hero of the Renaissance, a condottiere of the period of the civil wars in northern Italy. The mobile features were full of expression, but their hands were thick and soulless, almost coarse. It was not long until I had a clear idea of the man's character. He was simply incapable of listening. His one desire was to command. He made decisions without due consideration. He rarely conceded any point. It was quite out of the question to get him to change his mind. Owing to the many tasks he undertook, he was on the go day and night and spread nothing but unrest, hurry, and nervousness around him. His ambition, lust for power, mistrust, and vengefulness were matched only by the morbid inferiority complex, and his mind Moser-like sensitivity. With all of this, he was well aware of his limitations. Anyone who had the advantage of him in education, experience, knowledge, or ability was not suffered anywhere near him on equal terms. He surrounded himself with youthful followers who could be dazzled by the zest and tireless energy, and with weak creatures who applauded his caprices and his brutal jests, feared him, flattered his vanity, and believed him to be the great coming man. He was far too shrewd, however, not to be able to see through such people. He played with their destinies like mischievous child with tin soldiers. He was cunningly differential and amiable to his superiors, arrogant, brutal, overbearing, intolerably haughty to those below him. He had no moral inhibitions whatever in getting what he wanted. At the time, I was still only an interested spectator. I watched the man as one watches a rare and ferocious beast of prey in a cage. His powers were limited to the control of building needed for production under Degenkolb, and I did not suspect that he had seen in our undertaking the great opportunity of his life. He did not yet seem dangerous to me. I was soon to know better.
With Kammler taking pride in the project and Swatsky's ruthless efficiency in the tunnels were dug and expanded. However, Kammler was taking an interest elsewhere. Before the tunnels were completed, whilst the workers slept on the hard rock floor, malnourished, beaten by Swatsky, exhausted and lost, Kammler decided to take leave of the Mittelwerk facility. He travelled with his private driver on the roads east, the roads that traversed near the capital of a Reich that was stretched to its limits and further east. Blizna, a tiny hamlet, is lost amongst the forests of southwest Poland, where the only clearings within the dense trees are the long and thin patches of a land for farming, the traces of serfdom. Deep within the territory of the Reich, it was far from both the prying eyes of the RAF and of the Soviet Air Force that was yet to find its footing. But it was not the eyes of the foreign air forces that the members of the 444th Battery of the Artillery under Major Weber gathered worried over. Rather, it was the eyes of the Renaissance figure of Kammler. The facility belonged to the SS, therefore they could not request Kammler to leave as one of Himmler's deputies. The army had to bear the presence and hope that the firings went according to plan. But alas, they did not. They were the first 2 of the 8 rockets that would be launched until the end of the year, and they both failed miserably. Kammler watched closely as the second of the 2 crashed just 2.5 kilometers from the launch site. He turned and left. Under Kammler, the work was rapidly advancing at Mittelwerk Dora. Trainloads of prisoners arrived wearing the rainbow of colors upon their chests that denoted the crimes committed, reason for their incarceration, reason for their being slave labor, and for many walking into the tunnels that would mean their death. Red, political; black, asocial type; green, common criminal; blue, stateless; violet, conscientious objectors; pink, homosexual; white, deserters; yellow, Jews. Within the tunnels, prisoners put their hands to the walls to catch the moisture that seeped through the rocks, their only source of hydration, other than the dirty puddles that formed within the chisel and blast marks upon the floor. Holes in the floor that often gathered the human waste of the inmates. Time could not be wasted in the early phase of construction in the building of a camp for the inmates. If they died, their body lay for days in the squalor as critters began to feast, until eventually it was discarded, without a thought to the spirit it once belonged to. If a worker was caught slacking, if they were too tired to raise the tool that had been forced into their hand, Kammler had them strung from the supports of the tunnels, their lifeless corpses, an encouragement to the others to not let a tool fall unless it was to break the rock around. But they fell. According to the doctor of the camp, Dr. Pull, at the Nuremberg trials, the inmates received just 50 grams of meat a week, 120 grams of fat, 330 grams of bread per day. Dr. Seidel, the prosecutor, asked Dr. Pull how many calories were required per day, and he answered 2,400. Dr. Seidel then asked, in other words, you would say that a human being who gets only 850 calories, or 1,550 calories, is not in a position to live much longer? Dr. Paul answered, not at all. The calorie count for a prisoner of Dora was roughly just 900. Dr. Seidel's argument was Dora, under the command of the SS, was committing genocide by malnourishment. Paul was hung on the 7th of June, 1951, for his crimes. Kammler's brutality was shown in document NOKW-17 of the Nuremberg trials, taken from the transcript of a speech and discussion at an Air Force conference concerning aircraft and weapons production.
As usual, it is because the people have noticed that they are no longer treated severely enough. I had 30 people hanged as a special measure. Since they were hanged, everything has been to some extent in order again. It is the same old story. Whenever people notice that they are not being treated so severely as before, they take all sorts of liberties.
In December, snow covered the peaks of the Mountains of the Harz. As NSDAP skiing clubs carved tracks down, Albert Speer made a visit with his staff to the tunnels. What they saw was a scene from Dante's Inferno. It bothered some of Speer's staff greatly, those who had pushed papers and pencils, not seeing beyond their work to the human cost.
On December 10th, 1943, I inspected the extensive underground installations where the V2 was to be produced. In enormous halls, prisoners were busy setting up machinery and shifting plumbing. Expressionlessly, they looked right through me, mechanically removing their prisoners' caps of blue twill until our group had passed them. I cannot forget a professor of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, who testified as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. He too was in the Mittelwerk, which I inspected that day. Objectively, without any dramatic, he explained the inhuman conditions in this inhuman factory. The memory is especially painful, the more so because he made his charge without hatred, sadly and brokenly, and also astonished at so much human degeneracy. The conditions for these prisoners were in fact barbarous, and a sense of profound involvement and personal guilt seizes me whenever I think of them. As I learned from the overseers after the inspection was over, the sanitary conditions were inadequate, disease rampant. The prisoners were quartered right there in the damp caves, and as a result, the mortality among them was extraordinarily high. That same day, I allocated the necessary materials and set all the machinery in motion to build a barracks camp immediately on an adjacent hill. In addition, I pressed the SS camp command to take all necessary measures to improve sanitary conditions and upgrade the food. They pledged that they would do so.
But they didn't. Pohl's statements at his own trial would confirm this. The pastor to which Speer refers, but misstates, was at the visit of himself on the 10th of December, was Dr. Alfred Balakowski, who was arrested by the Gestapo on the 2nd of July 1943 for being a part of the French resistance. On the 16th of January, he arrived at Buchenwald before being transferred to Dora on the 10th of February 1944 and back to Buchenwald on the 1st of May 1944, where he bore witness to the horrendous trials in Block 46 involving typhus vaccines. Shortly after his visit, Speer wrote to Kammler, whom with Degenkolb had guided him through the tunnels, congratulating him profusely for the feat he had achieved in
transforming the underground installations at Niedersachsenwerfen, Mittelbau, from its raw condition 2 months ago into a factory, which has no equal in Europe, and which is unsurpassed even when measured against American standards. I take this opportunity to express my appreciation for this really unique achievement, and to ask you also in future to support Herr Degenkolb in this wonderful way.
So wrote the Speer, who was racked with guilt over the conditions he had seen. The situation was for the prisoners was amongst the most horrid imaginable, and all to produce, amongst other things, Wernher von Braun's A4. Von Braun himself in November had, after a discussion with Kammler, Dornberger, Zerwatsky, amongst others, on the 1st of November, stated in a proposal sent to Degenkolb on the 12th,
You have now given permission that the Schlier and Mitte facilities be manned with prisoners. In view of the difficulty of testing processes to be carried out there, the ratio of prisoners to German skilled workers for the foreseeable future cannot exceed 2-1.
Von Braun was now implicit in a crime against humanity. By the end of the year, just 1 kilometer from the entrance B to the Mittelbau tunnels, a camp in the relative fresh air, where death only partially hung within the nostrils, was constructed. It was also by the end of the year, the Mittelwerk had promised the Armaments Ministry that the first A4 rockets would have been produced. Zerwatsky had tasked Arthur Rudolph, the brilliant engineer whom von Braun had brought into Peenemünde, and who had then been sent to Mittelwerk as a representative, with overseeing their production under the threat of himself becoming an inmate if none were produced by the end of the year. Sure enough, as the clock of the year almost past ticked down toward the new, Arthur Rudolph stood in the snow, watching as 3 A4s were haphazardly transported from the tunnels and onto a camouflaged train transport. They need not have bothered. The A4s were sent straight back to Mittelwerk, due to the quality of their construction being of such poor quality that there was no chance of them working. The rocket program that had based itself on careful calculations before had, like many Nazi regime projects, been pushed by desire for speed and results. Nearly all of the rockets were failing. They were either blowing up on the test pads shortly after ignition, blowing up in mid-air, or breaking up on re-entry. Dornberger, exasperated, decided that it only could be problems within the manufacturing facility that had recently begun to produce the rockets. Von Braun was dispatched to investigate. In the tunnels of Dora, he bore witness to the squalid conditions. He saw the blasting of further tunnels and the enslavement of his program of 10,000 people. Yet he did not see himself as part of it. He was a rocket scientist. He produced designs and drawings, gathered materials. The production of the rockets was out of his sphere, but nevertheless there he was walking amongst the incarcerated of a criminal regime, inspecting their work so that the rockets he wished to launch could fly. However, in February, as von Braun watched on a Never A4 exploding at the test site in southwest Poland, despite the failures on launch, Mittelwerk had produced 56 A4s in January, and slowly the number would rise. On paper, the camp was a success, and for this Kammler was promoted to SS Gruppenführer. Shortly after his visit to Mittelbau-Dora, Wernher von Braun received a telephone call to his office. His secretary, Miss Lewandowski, answered. It was the office of the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Von Braun was not on Peenemünde at this time that his office received the call, but he and his brother Magnus were on their way, flying in a small Stork aircraft. The Stork was produced by Fieseler, who amongst other things were responsible for the A4 or V2's competition, the V1, known more commonly as the Buzz Bomb or Doodlebug, the flying bombs that were produced alongside von Braun's own rocket in Mittelbau-Dora. Upon landing, the handsome and tall von Braun leapt from the Stork that he had been piloting and walked towards the administration building. Miss Lewandowski had seen the Stork approach, and with a note in hand from the telephone call she had received, she approached the rocket scientist. An order from one of the many plinths of the hierarchy of Nazi Germany could not be ignored, as much as one may have wished to. Von Braun stated he was surprised, but then again Himmler was his superior ever since he had joined the SS. He had little choice but to freshen up and return to his plane as soon as possible and fly the distance from Peenemünde to a town known then as Großgarten in the wilds of East Prussia. The aerial route was similar to that one that he, von Braun, and his superior Dornberger had flown previously, when they had flown to Rastenburg to make a presentation to Hitler. Himmler, ever maintaining the appearance to the Führer of a faithful lackey, while simultaneously building up through his SS and RSHA organizations under his command a state within a state that he was in charge of, hence the title Reichsführer SS. Therefore, in 1941, Himmler had the SS begin construction of a headquarters for himself, just 20 kilometers away from Hitler's own. A large concrete bunker had initially been constructed, followed shortly thereafter by a number of well-camouflaged amongst the trees wooden cabins to hold the administrative staff, guards, security, and for meetings on the days when it felt safe to do so. Upon von Braun's arrival, he was directly escorted to see the Reichsführer SS, who he later noted was sat behind a simple wooden desk. The man who held so much power, who had been a simple chicken farmer but now commanded a military arm of a nation as well as the power to take life away at a moment's notice, was sat in a forest, almost as isolated as one could be, if it were not for the 48 members of staff around. Himmler greeted von Braun as if he were an old friend.
I must confess that I felt a bit jittery when I was shown into his office, but he greeted me politely and conveyed rather the impression of a country grammar school teacher than that horrible man who was said to wade knee-deep in blood. I trust you realize that your A4 rocket has ceased to be an engineer's toy, he spoke up, and that the German people are eagerly awaiting it. I can well imagine what a pitiful position you are in, a poor inventor, enmeshed by the army bureaucracy. Why didn't you come to us? You know that the Führer's door is open to me at any time, don't you? I shall be in a much better position to help you lick the remaining difficulties than that clumsy army machine. I replied coolly that in General Dornberger I had the best chief I could wish to have, and that it was technical trouble and not red tape that was holding things up. I ventured to compare the A4 with a little flower that needs sunshine, fertile soil, and some gardener's tending, and said that by pouring a big jet of liquid manure on that little flower, in order to have it grow faster, he might just kill it.
Himmler looked at the rocket scientist before him. For a moment, von Braun's answer might have been his end. But Himmler smiled and laughed. Von Braun had stood up to the Reichsführer SS and lived. But surely at some point, by shaking the hands of someone so evil, being merely in their presence, knowing the power that they had, the destruction that they caused, the lives they extinguished, surely one would have to look at oneself and ask, am I not evil too? Thank you for listening to the Achtung History Podcast, produced by the Berlin Tour Guide and presented by myself, Simon J. James. This was The Nazi and the Moon, Episode 3, Dora. If you want to find out more about the Achtung History Podcast, follow on Instagram and Twitter at Achtung History. Visit the website at theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History, or support this podcast at patreon.com/Achtung History.